Welcome to the sixth podcast in our series of Blenheim Book Club. Many of you will have heard of the Yalta Conference, which took place towards the end of the Second World War. But I suspect that, like me, very few of you will be aware of the crucial part played by the daughters of three of the main protagonists: Sarah Churchill, Anna Roosevelt, and Kathleen Harriman. Join Catherine Katz as she explains their role in the development of the world post-Second World War.
So, hello and welcome everyone to what I think you'll find an absolutely fascinating talk by my guest today, Catherine Grace Katz. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today.
It's wonderful. I feel as though you're in the room with me, even though you're in Chicago, presumably.
I am. Yes, I am home. It's Thanksgiving week here in Chicago, and it's a great time to be with family and get ready for the holidays.
Excellent. And well, thank you even more for giving up your time. Now, Catherine is the author of this absolutely fascinating book called The Daughters of Yalta. And it looks at a very important event during World War II, so coming towards the end of the war. But Catherine has put a unique perspective on it, which I think you'll really enjoy. And it's something, it's just something I had never, ever thought about, contemplated. Really interesting, really great stuff. So, Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you, and you're going to tell us about these wonderful daughters, and then at the end we'll have a chat and take it from there. So, Catherine, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antonia. It's so much fun to be here with you. And thank you to all of you who are listening. I had the great pleasure of visiting Blenheim Palace for the first time while I was a graduate student at Cambridge doing my MPhil in modern European history. And one weekend, I had the chance to go over to Oxford. I was on the sporting clay shooting team, and we had a tournament in the Cotswolds. And while I was there, I knew I couldn't miss my chance to visit Blenheim Palace. So it's one of my favorite experiences while I was studying at Cambridge, and I can't wait to come back and visit again soon. It's a huge honor to be speaking with you today in celebration of Winston Churchill's birthday on the 30th of November. So if you're tuning in on the day, wonderful. If you're tuning in later, it's always a great time to celebrate the connection between Winston Churchill and Blenheim Palace. Of course, Churchill has a very long connection with Blenheim, beginning at the very beginning. He was, of course, born at Blenheim Palace on the 30th November, 147 years ago. And of course, his life milestones continued with Blenheim Palace. That was the place that he proposed to Clementine Churchill in 1908. And Antonia was kind enough to share a couple of wonderful photographs from Blenheim's collection with me, one of which I'll share with you now. You can see Churchill here in the library at Blenheim Palace. This is such a wonderful picture. And I can imagine thinking back to when I came to visit, and I could really see Churchill sitting there, and I can't wait to come and visit the permanent exhibition of Churchill and his connection with the palace on my next visit over, so hopefully soon. I'd love to get started here with a couple of photographs just to set the scene for the story that we're talking about today. And one of these pictures may be very familiar to you. This is a photograph taken in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference, the last meeting of Churchill, FDR, and Stalin at the end of World War II. You can see the three leaders together with their military advisors behind them. This is one of the very famous pictures from the war. This is one that's often in history textbooks, on the cover of books about World War II. And what I think is really striking about this picture is the expression on the three leaders' faces. They look very tired, they look concerned, they look like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders. And this is very understandable given what they came to Yalta to discuss. At this point in the war, it looks like the war in Europe is finally coming to a close and will end sometime in the late spring or early summer of 1945. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended. The race is now on to see which Allied army will be the first to liberate Berlin. And with that comes some pressing questions, namely about how to handle Germany as soon as the war is over. Should Germany be allowed to remain one country, or should they be broken up into a group of smaller states in hopes that that will keep them from rising up as a belligerent for a third time in half a century? Also incredibly important, especially to Winston Churchill, is the future of Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the very beginning, and he wants to make sure that when he returns home to London, that he can look his colleagues, the Polish government in exile, who have been in London ever since the beginning of the war, that he can look them in the eye and say that he did everything he could to defend their sovereignty all the way through. Stalin, meanwhile, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. Poland has been a source of weakness for the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire dating back all the way to the Napoleonic era, when the Polish flatlands were the key to the invasion of the Russian Empire by Napoleon, and then, of course, again by the Nazis during the Soviet era. So Stalin wants to make sure that when the war is all over, that after all the sacrifices the Red Army has made, that he will have a government in Poland that's going to be friendly to the interests of the Kremlin. FDR, meanwhile, is a little bit more focused on the Pacific, where the war has not progressed quite as far. He doesn't yet know if the atomic bomb will be an option, so he's looking at the need for a potential ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. He wants to save as many American lives as possible, and to do this, he wants to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions. Also extremely important to FDR is what he really sees as his personal legacy at the end of the war. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed with the League of Nations, and he wants to create a lasting organization dedicated to securing world peace. This, of course, is the United Nations. He sees this as a mechanism to guarantee, if not eternal peace, certainly peace in Europe for 50 years, he believes is an attainable goal. And to do this, he really needs the Soviet Union to buy in. He sees this also as a way to bring the Soviets into the international community when the war is over and the common enemy has been defeated. So you can understand some of the gravity of the issues that are facing these three leaders, which gives a bit more context to this picture that we all know. What I did not realize when I began researching the Daughters of Yalta is just what it took for the leaders to physically get to Yalta. Yalta is in the Crimea, which has been in the news a great deal lately, going back to the invasion of the Crimea in 2014, and of course, Russia making moves in that region again. But back then, it was a place that was very remote. And Stalin at this point realizes that he holds more cards than do his allies. And so if they want to meet him, he's going to have to say, you know what, you're coming to me. He's afraid of leaving his borders. He doesn't want to leave his security team. He's also very paranoid about flying. And so he says his doctors advise him it's bad for his health if he travels. So Churchill and Roosevelt have to come to him. For Churchill, this means flying first 1,300 miles to Malta, where he'll rendezvous with FDR. And very tragically, on the way, one of the British planes carrying members of the Foreign Office goes down off the coast of Italy, and several members of the Foreign Office are killed, which is a real tragedy and casts a shadow over the beginning of the conference for the British. Roosevelt, meanwhile, has to travel across the Atlantic Ocean in a destroyer convoy. This takes about a week, and they're still sighting enemy U-boats as they're traveling. So this is not a safe journey by any means, and you cannot imagine any security team today allowing their principal to undertake that kind of risk. Once in Malta, they then have to fly on almost 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands where there are anti-aircraft units. One of the planes in the advance team actually gets its tail shot up on the way. And then they have to land in the Crimea at an airfield with a runway that is far too short for the kinds of planes that they're flying, in a runway that is shrouded in fog. And then they have to drive another 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, until they finally arrive at Levadia Palace. Levadia Palace was once the home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in the summertime. This was their retreat away from the pressures of court life, where they could really be a family. The Tsar and his children would swim in the sea, ride horses, play tennis. However, all of this idyllic life, family time, really came crashing down in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, when the Soviets brutally murdered the Tsar and his family, and they nationalized his palaces, including Levadia Palace, and turned it into a rest home for favored Soviet workers. This went on until the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded the Crimea, and they decided to use this palace as their Crimean headquarters. So they were there for several years until the Soviets pushed them out shortly before the Yalta Conference. And on their way, the Nazis stripped the palace of everything they could carry. All of the art, the furniture, the lamps, the dishes, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could use as scrap metal. The Soviets have just 3 weeks from the time that the three Allied delegations agree this is where they're going to meet to frantically restock this villa and turn it into a site fit for one of the most important conferences in world history. So what they do is they take the contents of glamorous hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, and they put them on trains and cart it 1,000 miles south and frantically restock the villa using conscripted labor, Romanian POWs, again, Soviets doing what they do best, throwing manpower at the situation, and they do get everything ready just in the nick of time. However, I think that this beautiful facade in a way is very indicative of the Soviet Union itself, where what you see on the surface is not necessarily what lies beneath. Yes, it is a beautiful palace. Yes, it has been prepared to the extent possible during the war. However, still in the palace, there are bed bugs everywhere. The Soviets could not evict the bed bugs, and they have to spray everything in DDT, which we now know was a very bad idea. But of course, there are other types of bugs as well, of the electronic variety, that have been planted in the private quarters of the president and in the palace reserved for the prime minister just down the road. So it just gives a little bit of context of this world in which they will all be descending. So you go back to this picture, and now we understand a little bit more about the issues on the table, what it physically took to get to Yalta, just the setting itself, which is so palpable and such a character in the story in a way. But I also love looking at this picture for another reason, and that is in combination with another photograph of the exact same scene taken from a slightly different angle, which shows something a little bit different. Because off to the side, you can see two young women. These young women were Sarah Churchill and Kathleen Harriman. There was a third young woman, Anna Roosevelt, and these are the daughters of the Prime Minister, the President, and the American Ambassador to the Soviet Union. And in all the time I had studied the Yalta Conference in school, I had never realized that these three women had been at Yalta serving as their father's aides. And it brought to mind several questions. First, of all the people these leaders could have brought with them to serve as their aides, what was so special and unique about the experiences and abilities of their daughters that made them the perfect partners to serve in this environment? And second, we have a tendency to put people like Churchill and Roosevelt on a pedestal to the extent that they become more than human and very hard to relate to at times. But at the end of the day, they're also just someone's dad. And what would it be like to be their child in the midst of this, all of this upheaval and chaos at the end of the war on this transition from World War to Cold War? So those were some of the questions that were percolating in my mind as I began researching the story of these three remarkable daughters. Kathleen Harriman was just 27 years old, Sarah Churchill 30 years old, and Anna Roosevelt was 38. And I thought that was really just quite remarkable that they were there. But before we get there and talk about each of them in turn, I want to introduce you to someone else. This is me in third grade, and ever since I was little, I have loved history. I was always reading stories of history. My grandfather served as an officer in the Navy during World War II, and I would chase him around and ask him to tell me his stories about growing up during the Great Depression and serving in the war as the family self-appointed historian at about 10 years old. I also loved movies like The Great Escape and White Christmas and The Sound of Music, very much the World War II theme. And I was really fortunate to grow up in a neighborhood just north of the city of Chicago, where local history was something that was really important to our school and our curriculum. And we had the opportunity as third graders to go and live like pioneer students, people who were our same age, and experience what it would be like to literally put ourselves in the shoes of the people who came before us, experiencing a pioneer school day, cooking a pioneer meal. And it was this experience of transporting myself into history that really stayed with me, and I think has shaped the way I approach this, telling the stories of history today. I think it came as a surprise to no one in my family that I became a history major in college. This was taken the morning I turned in my senior thesis at Harvard, and I was inspired by my love of The Great Escape to write about British prisoner of war escape narratives and the role of these stories in British culture. And surprisingly, I ended up having an encounter of sorts with Winston Churchill along the way, because Churchill had written the first of what we think of as these great tales of escape about his own escape from a Boer POW camp in 1899 when he was just 24 years old. And it was, of course, the story of his escape that rocketed him to fame in Britain and really launched his political career. Little did I know I would soon be spending time with Churchill once again, traded in Cambridge, Massachusetts for Cambridge in England, which was absolutely wonderful. And for one who's a historian, there's really no better place to be immersed and surrounded by history everywhere you turn. Here, I wrote my dissertation on early counterintelligence practices, and once again, Winston Churchill popped up, this time as Home Secretary during the First World War, where he was overseeing a massive postal censorship program in hopes of reading the mail to discover enemy German spies who might be lurking in their midst as an early national security method. So here I'd had 2 years spending quite a lot of time with Winston Churchill, and like so many recent graduates, I then felt the pressure to do what so many do and traded in beautiful, idyllic Cambridge for the hustle and bustle of New York City. So quite a bit different, as you can imagine. But little did I know that coincidences were about to all come together in one space, because in the lobby of my office, much to my surprise, was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, named after Winston Churchill's country home. Chartwell Booksellers is, as I understand, the only bookstore in the world that specializes in books by and about Winston Churchill. And here it was in the lobby of my office, and I found myself on many afternoons saying I was going to get a coffee, but really I was sneaking into the bookstore to chat about history with the owner. I clearly missed history very much, and I wanted to find my way back to it, but I wasn't sure how. Before long, the owner suggested that I should meet a group called the International Churchill Society, made up of scholars and academics and professionals of all different varieties that want to encourage people to study history, foreign relations, and go into public service inspired by Winston Churchill. Also involved are members of the Churchill family. And shortly thereafter, the Churchill Society was hosting a dinner across the street from my office featuring Madeleine Albright as a keynote speaker. And I thought, gosh, I would love to go and hear her speak. I'm sure I could learn a lot. And so off I went to this dinner, and little did I know that things in my life were about to change quite dramatically. Shortly thereafter, the Churchill family and Churchill College at Cambridge were opening the papers of Sarah Churchill, Winston Churchill's middle daughter, to researchers for the first time. And after meeting the group at this dinner, they asked if I would be interested in potentially writing an article about Sarah's papers for their magazine, Finest Hour. I said, yes, this sounds like a very interesting project. It'd be a great way to do a bit of writing, stay engaged with history. Meanwhile, I was applying to law school. But the other reason I was very interested in doing this was because I had had an experience of sorts with Sarah Churchill from the time I was a very little girl. My family has been going to the cloister at Sea Island, Georgia every summer since I was little. And on the wall of the lobby is this beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day in 1949. She had eloped to Sea Island with her second husband, Anthony Beecham. And I'd walk past this picture every summer and always wondered about Sarah and her life. You know, what would it be like to be the Prime Minister's daughter? And here I had my opportunity to find out. If people know Sarah Churchill today, it was that she had been an actress and a dancer, and she had even starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But I was immediately struck not by Sarah's acting career, but by her relationship with her father, especially during World War II. Sarah and Winston had a very close relationship from the time she was a little girl. She said that she could understand the way her father thought and walk with him in silent step, following along his every thought, even if he wasn't speaking them. She implicitly understood. And much of this came from long hours that they would spend together in the garden surrounding their home at Chartwell, where Winston would be engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, which was, of course, bricklaying, which he would do to relax. Sarah and her father would spend many hours together in quiet contemplation, building these brick walls and enjoying each other's company. Sarah was very much like her father in temperament and spirit, and she really wanted to make her own way in the world. But of course, being a woman at this time in her position, it was very difficult to have a career. However, one of the things she thought that perhaps she might do was become an actress. To other parents, perhaps this might have been a more scandalous notion, but I think perhaps it wasn't quite as scandalous compared to some of what Winston experienced with his own mother, the American debutante Jenny Jerome, who she wrote plays for London's West End. She was rumored to have a snake tattooed around her wrist and scores of lovers. So by comparison, becoming an actress was quite tame. Sarah did become an actress, and very quickly she fell in love with the star of her very first show, Vic Oliver, who was significantly older than she was. He was an Austrian citizen, and he was, and this was in the 1930s, was when Winston Churchill was concerned about the winds of war coming from the continent, and he was very worried if Sarah was married to an Austrian, what this might do. And Sarah was in love, and so she eloped with him to New York, and they continued their careers together, very glamorous, of course. And I love this photograph that Antonia was kind enough to share with me, where you can see a very glamorous Sarah in sunglasses off to the side here. But it wasn't all entirely glamorous, unfortunately. The marriage shortly thereafter broke down, coinciding with the time of the outbreak of war and Churchill becoming prime minister. Sarah realized this was an opportunity to regain her freedom and her sense of identity in a way, and she decided to join up and do her bit for her country as a member of the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, where she was serving as an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer, looking at pictures that had been taken by recon pilots and making intelligence assessments about the types of enemy ships that were in enemy harbors based on the kinds of shadows that they cast, or looking at a field where the grass had been trampled and determining whether that was an enemy troop movement or just some cows that had been grazing in the area. She was also very involved in Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa, and has led to one of my favorite stories about Sarah and Winston. One weekend, Sarah came home for leave, and she went up to visit her father, and he says to her, "At this very moment, go sailing towards the Mediterranean are 542 ships." And Sarah says, "Actually, Papa, I believe it's 543. And he says, "How do you know?" And she says, "Well, I've only been working on it for the last 6 months." And he thought that this was hilarious, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "Because I believe there's such a thing as security." So Winston was so charmed and so proud of his daughter that he went down to dinner and told that evening's dinner guest, who happened to be Eleanor Roosevelt, this lovely story. Eleanor also thought it was so charming, so she went and told the press the next day, only for Sarah to then be hauled in front of her superior officers demanding to know who had told Mrs. Roosevelt this story, who had leaked this information to the press, and Sarah could only say, "I'm so sorry, but it was my father." Sarah and her father were about to embark on a very special journey together during the war, first at the Tehran Conference in 1943, when he asked her to serve as his aide-de-camp. There were several reasons why he wanted her to be the one at his side. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine had decided that someone from the family should go with the prime minister when he traveled abroad. And Sarah was really the perfect person for several reasons. As a WAF, she understood the military components of what was going on. As an actress, her training actually lent itself extremely well to diplomacy, where the doublespeak and the nuances and the presentation in public, which is not necessarily indicative of private feelings, is very much like being an actress. She also had this very close bond with her father from the time she was little, where she implicitly understood his every thought. And finally, Winston and Clementine knew that when the war was over, he would want to write his wartime memoirs as he had done after World War I. And Sarah was a beautiful writer and was a perfect person to capture everything that was happening outside of the official conference negotiations. She carried out her duties with aplomb at Tehran, and she was such an effective daughter diplomat that soon 2 other fathers took notice, the first of whom was Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman in 1943 had recently become the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, but long before that, he had had an illustrious career in business. He was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, a banking firm. He owned Newsweek magazine, shipping enterprises, mining enterprises. He was also the founder of Sun Valley, which was the first glamorous American ski resort, which he created as an incentive to encourage Americans to use his train lines to travel out west. He had 2 daughters, Mary and Kathleen, and he was not especially close to his daughters when they were little girls, as he was always off chasing business opportunities, and he and his wife divorced when they were quite small. However, he came back into their lives in a significant way after their mother passed away when they were teenagers. He was not a warm and fuzzy father by any means. However, he did have a unique outlook. And he said to his daughters, "I do believe that we can become the best and the finest of friends." And he made them an offer to become involved in his world and his business to any extent that it interested them, which was quite forward-looking for a man of his times. His older daughter, Mary, was not especially interested. However, his younger daughter, Kathleen, was. And she, much like Sarah and Winston, she was much like her father. She was a great athlete. She was adventurous and daring. She was an expert equestrian, a crack shot, and an Olympic-level skier. And she jumped at the chance to have an adventure at her father's side, first working with him at Sun Valley during her school vacations, And then when the war broke out and Averil Harriman was tapped to become the Lend-Lease envoy in London in 1941, he thought, this would be a great opportunity for my 23-year-old daughter to come with me in the middle of the Blitz and become a war reporter. Kathleen jumped at the chance, flew to London, arrived just after the worst bombing of the Blitz, and she and her father became very close friends with the Churchill family. One Churchill in particular, Pamela Churchill, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law, who soon became Kathleen's best friend and began an affair with her father, Averil. But the connection between the families is much deeper. In fact, they were all together celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news together about Pearl Harbor. In October 1943, Averil Harriman became the ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Kathleen decided to continue her wartime adventures with him. She moved to Moscow with him and really became in many ways his assistant ambassador. She learned to speak Russian for both of them, knowing that he wouldn't have time to do so. And she became the American woman who had more access to and experience with Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. When it came time for Yalta, after this long partnership between Averil and Kathleen, Averil knew Kathleen was the one he wanted at his side. She could serve as almost like a member of what we think of as a State Department protocol office today, where she would go and work with the Soviet and American advance teams, making sure that everything was ready and prepared to pave the way for the most efficient forms of diplomacy, iron out any cultural misunderstandings, and really serve as this liaison with her language skills, which made her so valuable. And I love this picture of Kathleen with a horse, because it's not just any old horse, but in fact, in recognition of the part that she played throughout the war, this is actually a horse that was gifted to her by Joseph Stalin. The third daughter who attended the Yalta Conference was Anna Roosevelt. And at 38, she was the oldest of the three daughters, and she was also the only mother. She had three children. And however, even though she was the oldest and the most experienced in some ways, she was actually the least experienced when it came to this world of foreign policy and diplomacy. Anna and her father were very close from the time she was a little girl. And I love this picture of the two of them together at Campobello Island, because it's one of the few that we have of FDR standing. And that's something that we don't see very often. Anna and her father were really bonded over the environment and nature when Anna was little. Her favorite memories of childhood were going on long rides through their land in the Hudson River Valley, where FDR would teach her about nature, about trees and animals and the way they all work together. And Anna imagined that someday she would grow up to become the co-custodian of sorts of their land in Hyde Park in New York. However, all of this quickly changed when FDR was diagnosed with polio, and suddenly Anna found herself at arm's length, really shunted aside to make room for all the doctors and nurses who now surrounded him and the political colleagues who now had to come to him. Anna was sent away to school, which she detested. Her parents insisted she become a debutante, despite the fact that they ridiculed this life very much in public and were known for their progressive politics. However, it did not extend to their daughter. She briefly attended Cornell University, but left to make a rebellious marriage at age 20 and had two children. However, the marriage very quickly broke down, and Anna divorced her first husband, but soon found love again on the campaign trail, where she fell in love with a Republican journalist. Her father, of course, was a Democrat, and her second husband became John Boettiger, this former Republican journalist, which I think is just a great indication of, even in today's polarized world, love can still conquer all. Anna and her husband moved to Seattle, where they became the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. But when Anna's husband joined the military in 1943 to do his bit, shortly after the birth of their son, Anna decided that when he shipped out to the Mediterranean, she was going to move home. So she moved home for Christmas in 1943, and of course, home at this time meant the White House. Soon after she arrived, that she noticed that there was something that was not quite right about her father. He was just not as quick with the details as she remembered. He looked like he was staring off into space for long periods of time with his mouth hanging open as if he couldn't get enough air, and she became very concerned. She insisted in the spring that he have a comprehensive medical examination, and unfortunately, this exam revealed that he was in fact dying of congestive heart failure, for which there was no cure. Anna and the doctor were sworn to secrecy. They could not tell anyone about his diagnosis. Even Eleanor Roosevelt really couldn't bring herself to see that there was something wrong with her husband. And curiously, FDR never once asked what was wrong with him. You can understand, perhaps, as a wartime president, the sense of your own mortality is not something you can contend with as you're trying to win the war and you have to look to the future. So it really fell to Anna to become his gatekeeper. She began taking on a much larger role in the White House, deciding who really needed an audience with the president and who she could have meet with someone else. Sometimes she even went so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who she felt could handle them. And even though FDR didn't know exactly what was wrong with him, he knew Anna was doing something very important to protect him and that he really could not get along without her. Anna had long wanted to accompany her father on his overseas voyages during the war, but he had always turned to one of her 4 younger brothers instead, really as physical supporters to help him stand and move. And Anna felt very much left out and shunted aside once again. And she was trying so hard to recapture this closeness that she remembered with her father from the time she was little and become a person of value in his life once again, and wanted that acknowledgement from him, which he was unfortunately very reluctant to give. However, in January 1945, Roosevelt cabled his friend Winston Churchill, and he said, "If you're thinking of bringing Sarah to this conference again, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna." So Anna finally has her chance to be her father's aide and travel with him to perhaps the most important wartime conference of all. However, she knows that her father is dying, and she is trying every day to keep him alive. And tragically, this is probably the last time that she will have any opportunity to really spend with him. So she's cherishing every moment, and yet she's the person keeping this terrible secret. I love this photograph of the 3 women together at the Yalta Conference because I think it shows a little bit of their unique personalities. You can see Sarah in her military uniform, Anna in the middle in a sensible tweed, and Kathleen on the end in an elegant fur coat. And even though they each had different skills and abilities that made them the perfect partners for their fathers at Yalta, I like to think of them collectively as daughter diplomats, where they were able to deliver subtle, nuanced messages that someone in a more official capacity in the Foreign Office or the State Department might not be able to do, and gather information and bring it back to their fathers and tell them about what they saw, including going out into the local community and meeting people in the Crimea whose lives had been pretty summarily destroyed by the war and whose futures were being put together by the conference negotiations taking place at that very moment. And I think for their fathers, they also very much serve as the embodiment of the future and what they were all fighting so hard to preserve. Things had not ended well at the end of the First World War. The peace agreements that turned into not to peace, but instead a global depression and then a Second World War. And I think that there was a sense that Churchill and FDR, and perhaps even Stalin to some extent, really wanted to make the world secure for their children, kind of metaphorically. Before these fathers at the Yalta Conference with their daughters very much served as this tangible reminder of what they were all fighting for. I just want to close there with a few thoughts about what the Yalta Conference and the experience of these 3 daughters can tell us about our world today. And first, I like to think about our relationship with Russia. The relationship between Russia and the West is complicated. It certainly has been since the end of World War II. And currently, depending on when you're watching this, perhaps Putin will have made more aggressive moves into Ukraine. But it just really goes to show that these relationships have a long-term effect. And if you look at FDR trying so hard to develop this personal bond with Stalin at the end of World War II, you can see some of the challenges that leaders still face in dealing with the Russian president today. Roosevelt was so successful often in his domestic policy because he had these great interpersonal skills. He called it touchy-feely politics. He could really relate to the common man and encourage people with his force of personality. However, when it came to dealing with Stalin, this didn't work so well. He did have a great personal relationship with Churchill. However, when it came to Stalin, he was not going to be persuaded to change his opinion based on liking or respecting you. And I do believe he liked and respected FDR. But I think it's just a good reminder that now successive administrations, at least in the US, have tried to build this personal bond with Putin. And unfortunately, as with FDR and Stalin, that just does not amount to much. And instead, we need to look for areas of mutual cooperation and benefit, but not rely on that person-to-person connection. Also, very interesting, I think, is the idea of the unelected family members in the official duties of an elected member of government. To some extent, I kind of think when you elect a president, in a way, it's kind of like when you marry someone. You marry someone, you marry their family. When you elect someone, in a sense, you elect their family. And here in the US, we have certainly agreed that there should be a more public role for a first spouse, for a first lady. But what about adult first children? That's something that we hadn't had to think about for quite a while until the Trump administration, because there had been many very young children in the White House. But I think it's also just something that we should talk about in the public conversation about. Of course, course, your family is going to be involved. They're often your greatest advisors. But what kind of public role should they have? And what can the experience of these three daughters tell us about that appropriate balance between support and when does it go too far? I like to think that the daughters struck the perfect balance. They were not necessarily in the conference negotiations where they didn't have security clearance, but that's not to say that they weren't incredibly impactful in their father's decisions and in the outcome of Yalta. And finally, I'm so glad that we have the technology to be able to do this and to gather together using Zoom. However, I also think that Yalta can really tell us a lot about the importance of in-person connections. And I hope to get back to that as soon as possible. They wanted to meet, Churchill and FDR really wanted to meet with Stalin in person to hammer out the details at the end of the war. They could have communicated by telephone or by telegraph. However, meeting in person was really, really key. And they were willing to take on great personal risk to be able to do so, traveling all the way to the Crimea despite the dangers that that entailed. And also the importance to the Yalta Conference and the connection of the United Nations and how creating a forum for diplomats from all around the world to meet together, to hammer out concrete plans to understand each other and overcome differences was something that was really important, and I think is one of the great legacies of the Yalta Conference, as complicated as it is. So I hope that as soon as possible, I'm able to come back and visit you at Blenheim Palace in person. With that, I'd love to chat with you, Antonia, about this story and about some of these remarkable figures from history.
Catherine, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I've got so many questions. There were so many times when I thought, I'll just... this is in no particular order, but just picking up on what you said a moment ago about kind of the unelected wider family. And you mentioned Anna Roosevelt was very mindful of her father's health and wanted to protect him. So she was taking papers out of his files and distributing them elsewhere. Now, do you think that would have been tolerated today? Wouldn't that raise an enormous scandal?
Her role is a complicated one, and she, on the one hand, it's easy to criticize her for what she was doing, kind of being this gatekeeper, even, going so far as distribute papers, and maybe that is, going a little bit too far. And at the Yalta Conference, she was really running interference in many ways, trying to protect her father as much as possible, keeping unnecessary meetings from having to take place, keeping people out of his room as much as possible, even sometimes going so far as to block Churchill from meeting with FDR. And on the one hand, you could blame Anna for this, but on the other hand, I think that kind of at the highest level, the buck stops with the president. FDR, should have been having some of those meetings, especially with Churchill, in advance of meeting with Stalin, but was concerned about looking like he and Churchill were ganging up on Stalin. So he kind of allowed Anna to play this role to suit his political aims. However, even if Anna shouldn't have been doing this, she also was literally trying to keep him alive. No one knew how sick he was. There were some rumors that he wasn't well, but no one knew. And if she hadn't done that, perhaps FDR might have died while at Yalta, and who knows how history might have been different. But her role, and even Eleanor Roosevelt's role, really came under a lot of scrutiny, especially later in his administration. Members of the public sometimes felt that Eleanor took on too much of a public role, which she did really to extend FDR's reach and influence and advocate for women, which was great. But sometimes people felt that that was going beyond what her role was as an unelected person, and kind of that balance between providing support and speaking up for people, but also recognizing kind of the balance of who is elected and who is fundamentally a private person, and kind of where can we draw a bright line rule. I think that's really tough, but it's something that we should talk about.
And again, it's interesting what you say about Anna keeping her father alive, because of course he died just a few weeks later, didn't he?
Yes, just 8 weeks later.
Yeah, I mean, which is extraordinary, really. When there's a quote from your book where you say that Anna existed to serve her family, especially the men, and to keep them tranquil and content, which again I found really interesting, because I know that Winston Churchill at a certain time in his life, I mean, hopefully several years before Yalta, perhaps didn't kind of value the women in his family, his daughters, quite as much as he valued his son. So I suppose my question is, what do you think Roosevelt's attitude was towards his daughter? Was she not quite as important as his sons? Was she, after Yalta? Well, yeah, I suppose he only had a few weeks after Yalta. What do you think?
Yeah, that kind of relationship between Roosevelt and the women in his family and Churchill and the women in his family is really interesting. And actually what I found is, you think of FDR as being this very progressive figure who was really a champion for the rights of women, along with Eleanor, and they were a great team. However, when it came to the actual treatment of the women closest to him, Anna and Eleanor, it really was quite shocking that progressive mentality often didn't translate to them. And Anna, I remember the quote that you're talking about exactly. She had been very frustrated that she had repeatedly asked if she could participate along with her brothers in accompanying FDR on these voyages to help, and he always shut her down, and Eleanor felt the same way. And so Anna and Eleanor wrote to each other and kind of said FDR sees women as they should just be here to keep the home fires burning, and any troublesome female should just be appeased from time to time. And so she really is kind of caught between wanting to have this recognition that she so desperately craves from her father, but also being so desperate to do anything to get that she will, give of herself to help him and protect him, even though she's just not receiving that recognition in return, which is so heartbreaking to see and was really challenging to write about. And unfortunately, that recognition doesn't ever come from him directly and comes from other people outside of the family, including his mistress, Lucy Mercer, which is a whole other secret that Anna was keeping, which maybe I'll not spoil that here and leave it for people to read about. But I actually found Churchill to his value, the value that he had, or the value he saw and acknowledged in his wife and daughters was something I think grew immensely over time, especially during the war. And it really was Churchill who, by the end of the war, has this great respect and admiration for his wife and daughters and what they've contributed to the war. And Clementine was his number one advisor throughout his entire life. And that was really something very special to see.
And Mary, his youngest daughter, also played her part during the war, I think, didn't she?
Absolutely. Both Mary and Sarah accompanied Winston to his overseas conferences, Sarah at Tehran and Yalta, Mary at Potsdam. And he really recognized and admired the immense value that they brought to his life, and that they were really, advisors to him, astute political thinkers. And just, it was kind of almost like a family privy council. And that was, really lovely to see that. And having had the chance to talk to Emma Soames about her mother and reading Mary's wartime diaries, you can really see that. And I think that's just so lovely and special.
Excellent. I'm just going to go back to the three daughters again. Yes. So tell me, how did they get on? Because you mentioned, they reached there to support their father, but I suppose in a way their fathers had different roles. So Harriman, for example, his role was different from that of Roosevelt and Churchill. So was Kathleen's role as his support different? Because hers started before the conference, really, didn't it?
Yes. Kathleen had a really functional role where she very much she's in the thick of it. She is part of the advance team. Her father leaves her there in Yalta while he goes off to Malta to first meet with Churchill and FDR on the way, so he can have some of the pre-meetings with them. And he leaves Kathleen to really oversee a lot of the preparations. And it's some of these roles kind of in a role like a protocol officer, where if they do their job extremely well, you almost don't notice that they were there because everything runs smoothly. There are no kind of cultural misunderstandings that can become huge issues, especially when there's so many Westerners coming to the Soviet Union who have never had any experience in Soviet culture, and Kathleen preparing briefing documents for what to expect and history of the local area and the culture and customs, and even kind of working to make sure the physical layout is acceptable and that FDR can get everywhere in his wheelchair and there aren't any steps that he'd need to negotiate. And so she really is very hands-on there, overseeing the details of the conference. But what's really interesting about the three daughters is that you almost think of them kind of as a block. Here are three women. Of course, they would be great friends. They have this unique experience. It's the only women who are kind of metaphorically at the table. However, it's the British and American objectives at Yalta aren't always aligned. And the daughters first and foremost are loyal to their fathers and to their countries. And that doesn't always put the daughters kind of on equal, having equal objectives. It's very interesting. The relationships among them ebb and flow, much like the relationships among their fathers. And really, especially Averil Harriman, who comes to see the world and the outlook for the Soviet Union much more similarly to Churchill, even though he's Roosevelt's deputy and ambassador, and kind of feeling very caught between them. And Kathleen is the one person he can express this to and have frank conversations with in an environment where it's really hard to have anyone that you can trust.
I wonder how, I think 3 is an awkward number. A lot of the time. I have 3 daughters, and sometimes, one of them gets left out. And you mentioned that Sarah and Kathleen were already knew each other, and they were family friends, weren't they? So
they were.
How must Anna have felt, A, to come into what essentially was Anna's domain in a way, Kathleen's domain, because she'd prepared everything and people would have been deferring to her. Plus there's Sarah, who knows her very well, and Anna comes in cold.
Exactly. That's a great question. Anna is, she outranks Kathleen in a way as the president's daughter, and yet members of all 3 delegations, the Americans, the British, the Soviets, are all so familiar with Kathleen because she has been in the inner circle since 1941. And Anna was out in Seattle at the beginning of the war. She only comes to the White House in late 1943. She has not had this overseas experience that the other 2 have been living with day in and day out for years. And so Anna does feel uncomfortable at times. And Kathleen is a very confident and assertive person, which is what allowed her to be so effective in her father's world. Anna, meanwhile, she really struggles with self-confidence sometimes, and you can see that self-confidence is lacking, and she sometimes feels that Kathleen is overstepping her bounds, and she kind of almost doesn't like Kathleen very much and feels perhaps a bit threatened by her. Meanwhile, Kathleen is completely oblivious that Anna is not too keen on her. And it's just interesting, kind of the power dynamics within the relationships and how the relationships between the fathers kind of trickles down to the relationships among the daughters. So it is really fascinating, even within the American delegation, that not everything's rosy all the time.
I think it's interesting as well that Anna was the only one who had children.
Yes.
Because again, it's not uncommon when you've had children to lose a lot of confidence in yourself. Because suddenly your world is taken up with children type things. So I wonder if that played a little bit of a part in it. There were these 2 beautiful, dynamic young women, footloose, fancy free, whatever. And I know Sarah had been married, but again, that's another story.
Exactly. Yeah, they all are in a bit of a different life position. Yeah. Kind of, she has, this more, with this greater wealth of life experience. She does have children, and it's also very difficult for her to leave her children behind through the duration of the conference. Her 2 older children in school, but her youngest son is only 5. He becomes very ill, gravely ill, while she's at Yalta, and she's so far away and can't do anything about it. And he actually ended up in the hospital, and the family was much more concerned about his health than FDR's health, which was really surprising to think about, kind of everything going on. But even the president is part of a larger family. You can really see that in the Roosevelt family dynamics. But Kathleen, she's young, she's single, she has brimming with confidence. Sarah has a little bit more seasoning. She is a few years older, and she has been married. And it was also just interesting for me. I started writing this book when I was 27, which was the same age as Kathy. I published it right around when I turned 30, which was the same age as Sarah. And even just seeing for myself in those 3 years, what a difference even a little bit more life experience makes. And then think about the decade between Kathleen and Anna. And, it was special to be able to write about these daughters at that phase in my life. Yes. And to think, would I have had the confidence and poise to be able to do what they did, to be able to get up and give a toast in Russian in front of Stalin, some of the most fearsome members of his inner circle, like Kathleen Harriman had to do at one of the dinners during the conference, and just have nothing but the utmost respect for what they achieved and the composure that they had throughout in a very difficult environment.
I suspect you probably would have done, to be honest.
To brush up on my Russian. Any Russian at all.
Catherine, should there have been 4 daughters there? I mean, Stalin had a daughter. Where was she? Did he not kind of at any point do you think, oh, well, if they're taking their daughters, I will take mine?
Yes, unfortunately, Stalin did not ever think that he should bring Svetlana, which is perhaps a bit of a shame because Svetlana did speak English, so she could have been a very useful daughter diplomat to him as well. And however, he did not like for her to engage with foreigners, especially Westerners, and he did not involve her in the way that the other fathers did. And they had a pretty terrible relationship at this point. Svetlana was 19 at the time of Yalta and was recently married and pregnant with her first child. And she had learned as a teenager that her mother had committed suicide, really driven to it by Stalin's cruelty. And she then rebelled and had a relationship with a much older married Soviet Jewish cinematographer who Stalin then sent to Siberia in retaliation. And then she fell in love again with one of her classmates who was also Jewish, which Stalin really took issue with and refused to ever meet his son-in-law. So relations between them are at an all-time low. But Svetlana had actually met Churchill on one of his visits to Moscow earlier in the war, where Stalin had brought her out at dinner time, almost like a prop to try to show that he was a family man too, in this kind of trying to kind of find his way with Churchill. And Churchill had a little exchange with Svetlana. She does speak English, and like Sarah, Svetlana is a redhead. So Churchill tells Svetlana about his own redheaded daughter. And after this, Svetlana sent a brooch to Sarah as a gesture of daughter-to-daughter diplomacy. And Sarah ends up wearing the brooch from Svetlana on her uniform throughout the conference. And I think it's just such a lovely gesture to the daughter who wasn't there.
Yes, gosh. Oh, right. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, if I may. So you've told us a little bit about how you met Churchill, as it were, in your bookshop, in the Chartwell bookshop, and that you became aware of Sarah's papers becoming available, etc. So, what was it that really gripped you and gripped your imagination, and where did that take you in terms of research? Because I know you didn't just sit at home and at the end of a computer. Tell us about the process.
Yes. Well, the story, it really started with Sarah, and it was this chance meeting with the Churchill Society and the Churchill family, and the timing of the papers becoming available for the first time. And it's one of the last times there will ever be new Churchill documents released, which was just incredible and I feel so honored that I was the person who was able to do that. And it's kind of one of those, you never know how your life is going to change when you walk out the door each day. And it very much was that situation for me. And so at first I thought perhaps I might write a biography about Sarah Churchill because her life was so fascinating. But the more I learned about the war, and especially her influence on kind of, I guess, inspiring the other two fathers to bring their daughters to serve at Yalta, I realized this is really the story. And I've always been fascinated by the history of diplomacy and foreign relations, but also the relationships. And fundamentally for me, this is a story about relationships. Yes, the geopolitical relationships, but the relationships between the fathers and daughters first and foremost. And the Churchill family very kindly introduced me to Kathleen Harriman's family. And through them, I was able to meet Anna Roosevelt's family. Kathleen only passed away in 2011. And when she died, her sons discovered her scrapbooks and letters from the war, and they very kindly shared those with me. I was able to interview FDR's granddaughter, Ellie Seagraves, who was 18 at the time of Yalta, and she's in her 90s now, but remembers everything so clearly because she was, on the cusp of adulthood. And so it was kind of this perfect moment of people who are still alive today who knew and loved these figures better than anyone, and the chance to see brand new documents that no one had ever seen before, which was really exciting. And also got to interview Churchill's secretary, Lady Jane Williams. So just the wealth of information and the kindness of the families sharing this with me, but also respecting the role of the historian and kind of the need for an impartial view. And I'm so grateful to all of them for that. So I was able to do research at Cambridge. I visited Chartwell, Churchill's home in Kent, at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park. All of Anna's letters and diaries are there. Avril Harriman's papers in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I got to visit Arden House, which was the Harriman's home up in the Hudson River Valley as well. The Roosevelt's home, which was just across the river, Chartwell. So really getting a sense of where these three daughters grew up and what their lives were like from the time they were little girls. And so it's kind of that combination of the archival research elements, which is really like a treasure hunt. And I love that. You never know what you're going to discover. And kind of just immersing myself in that environment of where they came from. And I think really kind of comes back to being a third grader and going to kind of live like a pioneer for a day. And I think that those two elements kind of coming together is what I really love about the storytelling in history.
I think, Catherine, I'm slightly disappointed that you're not wearing the dress and the little bonnet.
my little bonnet and my calico dress.
So nice.
I love Little House on the Prairie. I don't know if that's popular in England, but my favorite books, those were my favorites. I love Laura Ingalls. I'd come home from school and put on my little Laura Ingalls dress. I always loved history from the time I was little, and some of my favorite memories of being a little kid, or my mom would always read aloud to us. We'd read, before bed, read on the porch in the summertime, and it was too hot to do anything, and she'd read classic children's stories to us. Little House on the Prairie, The Secret Garden, Little Princess, Anne of Green Gables, of course, Harry Potter. And so I think just as memories of reading with my mom, and she loved history and especially English history, and that's something that's really continues to influence me today.
Catherine, you mentioned one of the joys of going into an archive or whatever is that you don't know what you're going to find. And I have to share with you something. I don't know if you will know this, but we, like you, we're blessed by having great resources and whatever, and sometimes something unusual will pop up. And we had the opportunity to look at the diaries of the estate clerk of the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Now, the 9th Duke of Marlborough was Winston Churchill's cousin. So when Churchill proposed to Clemmy, it was during the 9th Duke's tenure. And the clerk, his diaries were just, generally things like, today it snowed, this happened, that happened. But on the day of Churchill's wedding, he makes mention of it, and the fact that Churchill and Clemmy then caught a train from London to Woodstock, which is the town where Blenheim is situated, and they spent the first 2 or 3 nights of their honeymoon at Blenheim Palace.
That's so lovely. And the fact that he would just take the time to write that down, and just all of these interconnected stories, and you never know where people pop up and leave a mark on someone else. And it's so special. And I think there's no substitute for archival research, for seeing these things yourself, and you just never know what you're going to find. The greatest surprises comes from physically being in an archive and seeing what is there.
You're right. And I think in the same way that, this is great. It's a great way to communicate. One day, I hope that you'll be at Blenheim and we'll be able to sit down over a cup of tea and
that would be lovely.
Right. So I just lost my train of thought. Oh, no, I know what it was. So does it worry you? And it certainly worries me that in 50 to 100 years' time, when someone sits and thinks, that's interesting, I want to write about that, there'll be nothing for them to refer to, because people don't write letters in the same way anymore. Perhaps people keep diaries or journals, but not like in those days. And you mentioned Sarah documenting things because she knew her father would want to write about it. What do you think will happen in the future?
It's something I've thought a lot about, and I actually take a lot of inspiration and hope from ancient history and the practices of ancient historians, where the skills that you need to be able to tell the stories of, the Romans or the Greeks or, early antiquity, it's very different from if you're writing about the 19th or 20th century. And in such a paucity of documents and surviving material, there is still so much that historians of the ancient past have been able to reveal to us about what happened then in daily life, in the lives of leaders. And even though the materials that we'll encounter to be able to tell history in the future are going to be very different, they're going to be digital. And in a way, it's almost like we're suffering from too much information, where you could theoretically construct a person's life every second of every day, kind of using cell phone data and social media and email records, where it's almost so much that you can't use it effectively, or that the way that material is left behind doesn't capture kind of those reflections that someone might set out in a letter, where they take stock of their day and they assess what they've seen and their hopes for the future and their fears and concerns. And so not having that kind of more reflective element is something that I think about. However, I thinking about how much we can do with so little from the ancient past. I think that it'll just require historians to have different kinds of skills to tell the history of today and the future going forward. Just like, I have a different background and training to be able to tell the stories of, the 19th and 20th century as someone who's writing about Cleopatra. But I'm confident that creativity and resourcefulness will be with historians for generations, and that it will take different skills, but we'll be able to do it.
That's reassuring. Let's ask you probably just one final question, if I may. Two questions actually. What happened to the girls after the war? The Yalta Conference was just a few months before the end of the war. They were in the spotlight. They were very important. They were valued. They had a very important job to do. And then life changed. And I think particularly in a way for Anna, how did they adapt, do you think? What did post-war life look like for them?
They each had a tangible sense that they were living through a remarkable moment in history, and they each articulate how remarkable it is that they are essentially on the forefront of history, and they want to record what's happening for themselves to go back and remember that in the future. But they also know that it's a moment that's fleeting, and that it's an opportunity that will not be there forever to be with their fathers and to be able to participate in the way that they have. For each of them, they do find very fulfilling career and personal happiness in the years after the war, even though it is different. Sarah Churchill returns to her career as an actress. Her greatest role comes opposite Fred Astaire in 1951. So that's something, in the near post-war period. She's also an artist, really has that creative spark like her father did. And she is a beautiful writer and wrote several books. Kathleen Harriman returns to her work as a journalist at Newsweek magazine after the war, and shortly thereafter gets married and has 3 sons, and finds so much fulfillment and happiness in raising her family and sharing with them the love and adventure of the outdoors and skiing and horseback riding, and just really, just hearing her sons speak about the loving and wonderful home and family that she made for them. Just it's so striking. But she really didn't talk about the war or her experience in the Soviet Union because she kind of recognized that during the Cold War, she couldn't say anything that would be acceptable broadly, where if she spoke too fondly about her time in the Soviet Union, she'd be seen as a communist sympathizer. If she spoke warningly about what she saw, people would say that she was scaring people and heightening concern beyond reason. And so she just really said nothing. And Anna Roosevelt really, it's personally devastating when her father dies and the entire world that she's known as an adult turns upside down in an instant. Suddenly, she's no longer has a home where she's always had a home, neither the White House nor their home in Hyde Park, which has been left to the government to be the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And so it's a time of great transition and difficulty. Her relationship with her mother is difficult at the time because of other secrets she's been keeping during the war, and her husband really suffered from PTSD from the war. And that's something that each of the 3 women struggle with, that their husbands and people in their lives that they care about really are very scarred by the war, and we didn't understand the mental health issues that came from that the way that we do now. And so their lives, even though they don't walk away from Yalta to the best of friends, their lives continue to intersect in meaningful ways, and that shared experience that they have had is what kind of brings them back together at times to be a sense of comfort and reassurance to each other in some of these shared challenges. So I don't want to give kind of too much away about the very end, but their lives do continue to be intertwined in really unique ways.
Okay, well then really one final question. Who is your favorite?
That's like asking you to choose your favorite child.
I know. I didn't want to phrase it like that. Who's your favorite child? And why?
I love and admire them each differently for different reasons. I know that's such a cop-out answer, and I'm not really answering the question. But I have a huge respect and admiration for them each in different ways. Sarah Churchill, she was a beautiful writer, an absolute gift for politics like her father. Mm-hmm. She was such an astute observer of the world around her. And I think if she'd been born 10 years later, she could have succeeded her father in politics, which would have made her a contemporary of Thatcher, which would have been really interesting. But unfortunately, history doesn't always work out the way that we'd like. Kathleen is bold and daring and refreshing and very much kind of this modern woman making her way in the world, full of confidence, and her relationship with her father is fascinating. It's kind of more like they're colleagues than father and daughter in a way, which is unusual but effective for them. So she's just so much fun to read about and to write about. And for Anna, she experienced a lot of heartbreak and difficulty, and that was really challenging to write about at times. However, I felt like Anna gave me the greatest opportunity to grow as a writer and to explore the full scope of human emotion and challenge in life, which, you know, life is not always easy, and it wasn't for any of them, especially during the war. But I really, really felt like they each allowed me to grow as a writer in different ways, and perhaps no more so than Anna in her relationship with FDR. And so to each of them, I'll always be grateful. And I'm so thankful for the opportunity to tell their story, and that they, in a sense, found me to be able to tell that. And it's just been a great honor and a great pleasure. And I will be grateful for this forever.
Well, I think that's an excellent answer. And again, I can't recommend this book highly enough. And, you know, come and buy it in the Blenheim gift shop. You can get it online, etc. But definitely a must. And Catherine, it only remains for me to say thank you so very much, and enjoy your Thanksgiving celebrations.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, Antonia, and I so look forward to being able to come and visit you in person at Blenheim as soon as possible. So fingers crossed, I'll be able to get back over to the UK in the summer. So hope to see you then.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. What a powerful trio those girls formed, and what a relationship they had with their fathers. If you enjoyed this podcast, do share it with your friends, and subscribe if you'd like a reminder of when the next one becomes available. Next week at the same time, I'll be talking to Peter Clark as he takes us around Churchill's Britain and introduces us to some of the very special locations which held a particular place in Churchill's heart. I do hope you'll join me.